to Royal Oak History 101, finding your Royal Oak history. And as I said earlier, I approach this in a way that allows you to learn on your own, to be aware of the various sources of information that are out there, rather than me telling you about all of the history and facts and things like that outright. We'll do it through reviewing the various sources of information. I'm David G. Penney. If you have other questions for me, you can send them to my website, my email, davidpenney@comcast.net. Just be aware that Penny is like J.C. Penney, not like the coin. There's another E in there that's often invisible to people. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been offering a class through the Royal Oak School District, the Churchill Community Education Center, on the history of Royal Oak. And this televised class in 5 segments will supplement that class, act as kind of a base or a foundation for that class if you want to learn more about Royal Oak history in that class. I also want to point out that we have books for sale on Royal Oak history. These are a good source. This is my most recent book, My Royal Oak, Images from the 20th Century. It's mainly a picture book, although it has about 18,000 words of text. It was published in 2008, and it's available at Friends' Hardware and also at the Royal Oak Historical Museum on Webster. All proceeds from this book and the other books that I'll talk about that I've authored go to the museum. My wife and I are not taking any profits from these books. What we're going to do today is to talk a bit about city directories. I'll talk about newspaper photographs from newspapers, pics where you find them. This is kind of pictures, usually old pictures that you might find in the most unusual places where you're not expecting to find them. I think I always carry a camera with me in case I find something, either take a picture of something as it is in real life or take a picture of a picture that I find that's particularly interesting. We'll talk about Royal Oak Images, Yesterday's Charm, and so on. That's the title of a book that came out in 2006 that is a useful resource. We'll talk about postcards, oral histories, going out and recording what people say of their life and their experiences. Let's look at city directories. City directories, as we'll find, are a bit different than phone books. Now, this is the outside cover of a Royal Oak directory, and you can see it's advertising Herb Kidder Company, which was a lumber and coal company, Foreign, which was a Ford dealership, Ford Mercury, and other things. So the outside may not look all that different from phone books we see. But when you look inside, you'll see that they're quite different. This is an advertisement for Frederick D. Madison Incorporated, architects and engineers. He designed a number of buildings. For example, he designed the Royal Oak High School. This is the plaque, a bronze plaque, quite large. It's 3.5 feet tall, very heavy, constructed 1927. And down at the bottom it says Frederick D. Madison. Now I've enlarged it in this one. And you can see it says Frederick D. Madison Architect. And F.R. Patterson Construction Company, General Contractors. And you see his name on other other structures in Royal Oak, particularly schools. Here's an advertisement for Ballard's Garage. It sold gasoline, oil, and it would do repairs. And here the phone number is given as RO9869 or RO2622. Quite a actually good-looking service station. I have some Daily Tribune newspaper photographs here. This picture actually is in my Royal Oak. This is of a class at Whittier School in 1930. And you can see many of the teachers and of the students at Whittier School, which was an elementary school. It no longer exists. It was a victim of the demographic change in Royal Oak, and it was demolished, I believe, 2 years ago. It was on Farnham Street, just north of Alexander. Here's a locomotive going south on the tracks through town. It's actually, I imagine, stopped at the station, the old wooden station that was on the east side of the tracks and just north of 4th Street. You can see the streetcar tracks or interurban tracks crossing the railroad tracks. They actually cross there. So it's kind of a complicated junction. And there was a tower, a switch tower, on the west side of the tracks that kind of guarded this thing. And it looks like another, maybe a Mikado type steam locomotive that was pulling a number of passenger cars south to Detroit. This is an aerial view of part of Royal Oak, looking north from probably about maybe just north of where 696 is now, and it was done in 1945. You can see Main Street going north into the distance, or Livernois, as it's called other places. You can see Washington, kind of the other Main Street, as some people refer to it. You can see Washington School in the foreground. You can see the Episcopal Methodist Church, now First United Methodist Church, just west of Washington. You can see the new high school, and I just showed you, built in 1927, which became George A. D'Andrero High School, which is now the middle school. You can see the Washington Square building. It was the tallest structure in the area for quite a while. And here's an interesting photograph taken on Kenwood Street in 1950. It shows the mud. And of course, I can remember well, I was born in 1940, I was just a kid in 1950. When it rained in Royal Oak, often the sewers would be overwhelmed. We'd have flooding. Some of the streets were not paved with concrete or asphalt. And in areas that were being developed, where houses were being built, there was plenty of mud and cars could get stuck. And that car is stuck in the mud. This is a photograph of the 22nd City Commission in the 1960s. And as I said, I think in an earlier class, if you have a copy of Twigs and Acorns, I have listed in here all of the mayors and all the city commissioners of the city. And I probably won't be able to find those pages in here and I failed to mark them. But here it is, right here. The 22nd City Commission served from December 2nd, 1963 through December 6th, 1965. The mayor was L. Curtis Potter. And the commissioners were Klein, Gabler, Horn, Maudlin, Mitchell, and Patnales. In fact, if you look at the photograph carefully, you can actually read their names on the nameplates on the table. Picks where you find them. These are the pictures I found. This is just a sampling of what I found as I was kind of rambling around Royal Oak. Let's take one look at this one. This is at Oakview Cemetery, which is right across the street from the Triangle. And this is early in the last century when Oakview Cemetery was first established. It shows that there weren't very many trees. That's something that's kind of startling. Not very many trees. And this is very common if you look at areas of the country in the Midwest, the North, late in the 19th century and early in the 20th century. You see very few trees. They were cut down for fuel, for building materials, for farming. And I don't think that was any different here in Royal Oak. You can see out in front a car going by on Rochester Road. You can see Main Street. You can see the tip of what would be St. Mary's Cemetery. You can see a little building on the left, which later was expanded and is now the kind of the administrative offices for Oakview Cemetery. This photograph is actually a very long one, very, very long, probably 6 times as long as it is wide, probably again taken with one of those slit cameras. And it's in the little building that is the administrative headquarters for Oakview Cemetery. And it's in a place up on the wall. It's very difficult to photograph. That's why my copy of it, I would apologize for it, but this is the best I could do in terms of lighting and so on. Most interesting. This is a colorized photograph of a park that was located where the Royal Oak Public Library is now located, where the City Hall is located, where the police building. In fact, the City Hall was in a little building over to the right. You can see the back of it at that time. This would have been probably in the early 1940s. I just faintly remember the park because it had a pond in the center, and I'm just crazy about water. And there were also some monuments there, I think, to the volunteer firemen that you can see by the flagpole. That photograph or colorized photo was in the library for a long time. Now I believe it's over at the Historical Museum, and it'll be on display. It's quite large. This is a photograph that I found at Hollywood Market. In the front, as you go in, you get a basket to do your shopping. Up on the wall to the right will be this photograph from the 1960s, I imagine, because it shows a 1950, might be late 50s. I'll take that back. 50s. There's a 57 Chevy here, Bel Air, maybe a 56 or 55 Chevy, and some other cars. So it could have been late 50s picture, looking from across from where my great-grandmother and grandfather's house was on Main Street toward Hollywood Supermarket. And you can see the supermarket in the picture with the cars in front. Royal Oak Images, Yesterday's Charm and Today's Treasures. I don't have a copy with me. It's on sale at Francis Hardware. It's a very interesting book of architecture, primarily architecture in Royal Oak, different kinds of buildings, commercial buildings, houses, and so on. And there's some Royal Oak history included as well. It's a very well done book. It has some plates in the beginning of the book, the front of the book, that are in color. It won a prize, a state prize for a local history book. So it's certainly a good investment. Here's the cover of the book here, Royal Oak Images, Yesterday's Charm, Today's Treasures, as I said, of a house on Crooks Road. It was produced by a roundtable of Royal Oak historical organizations, a standing committee of the Royal Oak Historical Commission, City of Royal Oak, Michigan. And it was published, as I said again, in 2006. It has 272 pages. This is one of the pages in the front that are in color, showing the Gabler House and some others around the city. Beautiful houses during the summer when trees are out in bloom and leafed out. Some others with one historical photograph in this collection, and one commercial building in the lower right-hand corner. Here's a photograph of a house that has a statue of an American Indian at the back of the house. I believe it's at the rear of the house. On Springer Avenue, and it's an Indian statue that came from Hedges Wigwam, restaurant that was located on Woodward at 10 Mile Road many years ago. This is the picture of the Barrent House that's on Parkdale Avenue. It's actually a log cabin cottage built in 1917. It's not so easy to see, and you might be surprised that there is actually a log cabin in Royal Oak. It is there, it's still there, but it's a little off the road, so you have to look carefully. Here's a picture of Hedges Wigwam with the wooden Indians, as we'd call them, in front of the restaurant. The restaurant was a cafeteria style. There were interesting furniture inside. There was a pond with goldfish and a waterfall was quite a charming place. I remember going there a few times. My parents didn't take us out to restaurants very often. It was probably hard on the budget. But a few times we went there on special occasions, and it was a wonderful place. This is a B&C grocery store, and this brings up a topic that I find I'd like to mention, and that is that the B&C was located at 419 South Main Street, and it was a grocery, a supermarket maybe. It wasn't very large like our supermarkets today, but it was probably much larger than the average grocery. When it went out of business, the facade at the front of the store was covered, and other businesses went in there, and you didn't see it for decades. The sign at the top that says B&C. It's only been in the last couple of years that this has been uncovered, and it remains uncovered. It says B&C in two places on the front of the store, even though the grocery part is no longer a grocery store. So you'll often see the uncovering of facades and signs. I saw that happen at the Royal Oak Savings Bank, the bank on the corner of 4th and Main, and a number of other places. And if you're there at the right time, you can get a photograph of this, of the sign. There's only one major mistake in the book that I'm aware of, and that is that at the Shrine High School on 13 Mile Road, there's a statue in front of the high school of the Blessed Virgin Mary, but in the book it's labeled as St. Therese of Lisieux, of course, who the shrine is named after, Therese of Lisieux. So that aside, the book is very, very well done. What about postcards? I've acquired some postcards, or at least photographed or scanned postcards that deal with Royal Oak. Here's one of Center Street. And this is looking north of First Street, or north of 11 Mile Road along Center. The Center Street doesn't appear to be paved. Lots of big trees lining the road, and between the road and the sidewalk, lots of houses. Looks really quite idyllic. This is undoubtedly a colored black and white photograph, hand-colored. This is from a postcard of this bank, the Royal Oak Savings Bank that I mentioned a few moments ago, that's on the southwest corner of 4th and Main Street. This bank building was saved. Of course, the buildings to the south of it, where the Masonic Temple was located, have been lost. And there's a large high-rise loft building there now. But the bank building with the columns and so on has been saved, fortunately. And now on the first floor houses a jewelry store. This is an interesting photograph of the corner of Lincoln and Washington, would be the northeast corner of Lincoln and Washington. The building in the foreground is not particularly interesting to me, but as you go back from the front, you see the interurban coming along the track on Washington. There were two tracks, so the interurbans could go north or south at the same time without switching. And then in the distance, you can see the Episcopal Methodist Church, and behind it, most interesting, you can see the horse barns that were used. People brought their carriages to church. They got there using their carriages, and they had to have a place to put their horses. So the horses would be in the horse barns. And then if you look in the distance, you can see farther back into what would be the area of 4th Street going west, and there are huge areas without trees. Again, denuded of trees because the wood was valuable for so many things early on. In this photograph, we don't have an exact date on it, probably from the maybe the 1910s or before. A photograph of Washington at 4th Street, and this would be looking south along Washington. You can see the streetcar tracks going north on Washington, also turning and going east onto 4th Street. You can see some of the buildings along Washington. It's probably originally a photograph, fairly low resolution, and then hand colored. There's not a lot of detail when you enlarge the postcard. What about oral histories? I've done a lot of oral history taking myself many years ago when I was much younger, when many of my uncles and great uncles and grandfather and so on were alive. I went out armed with a tape recorder and recorded what they had to say, asked them lots of questions. I was just a big pest, I'm sure. But then I transcribed all of this information onto paper, typing it up and so on, and it was really worth it. Here's a picture of David Presley. He was then 100 plus. I think he passed away when he was about 102, as I recall. And Owen A. Perkins on the right here, who died very unexpectedly earlier this year, I believe. It was just a month or two ago. One of the major experts on Royal Oak history. He's going to be sorely missed for a number of reasons. This was at the Methodist Church. David Presley was had worked at his business, cosmetology school, until he was in his early 90s. Just an amazing gentleman. This is my mother, Gertrude Penney. I've recorded her on many occasions, going back probably 40 years, about her experiences when she was a child. This is on her 97th birthday. She's now 98 and going strong. She's somebody who recalls World War I, the end of World War I, and I had other relatives that until recently could recall happenings at the end of World War I. Marvelous that memory can afford us these facts. To get history info, oral histories, I recommend that you start with your family, with your mother, with your dad, if they're still living, with grandparents, uncles, aunts. So the earlier you start, the better in your life, because more people, older folks, will still be around. You can also ask elderly neighbors what they remember of your neighborhood and of your town. See what they say. Take a tape or a digital recorder, a pad of paper, a list of questions you'd like them to answer. It's a lot of fun. Most people who are asked will volunteer answers, will talk, and especially once they get rolling, they're much more open to providing information. After all, it's about them for the most part, and people like to talk about themselves. The internet and the World Wide Web, they're now a source of information. In talking to students yesterday at Shrine High School and in previous times, I remind them that the World Wide Web has only been around since about 1993. So 17 years, and that before that, other kinds of information, encyclopedias and books and so on, had to be used. But today we have Google, for example, this search engine where we can access information from all over the world quite easily. So I use Google a lot to look up things. And for example, on Google Earth, where we can actually look at maps and from photographs taken from space, from satellites, we can see things that sometimes still aren't there any longer. For example, here's a photograph taken from Google Earth of the Northwood School, the old Northwood School. And this was taken about a year after the school had been demolished. And the reason is that they don't update the maps every week or every month. So I was able to get the old school here while they were still building the new school at the top of the picture. So sometimes on Google Earth, objects and things still live that have already been demolished. Here's a photograph of Longfellow School, over on Maxwell. And this was after it had been demolished, but we can see it from space in this photograph. Here's a photograph of a larger area. This shows the triangle over on the left side. That is Rochester Road intersecting with Main and Crooks Road. And we can see Oakview Cemetery. And we can see the pond at the back of Oakview Cemetery. It's really remarkable what you can see from space. We can see gardenia and so on. eBay is useful, has been useful for me in purchasing antique objects that are of historical value in Royal Oak. For example, you might find a star bell on eBay. I'm not saying there is now, but you might find one. This is a number 4 star bell. Or you might find an inkwell there that was used in an old desk, or you might find a horse collar, or whatever it might be. Almost anything that you can imagine from the past is available at one time or another on eBay. You simply need to search. I get email from people because I suppose I'm known to have an interest in Royal Oak history, and also I have the website, Historic Royal Oak. The people ask me questions about the past, and sometimes I can answer the questions and sometimes I can't. If they're asking about an individual house, what's the history of the house, the chances are very slight that I'm going to know anything about that. But if it's about maybe a prominent citizen, I probably could come up with something. In this case, a woman whose name I don't recall just now sent me an email and volunteered information about Julius Braun, who was a resident of Royal Oak and lived on Main Street in a house that was demolished long ago. It's the same site as where the Royal Oak Savings Bank building is now, the one that was preserved, the beautiful bank building with the columns in the front. And here's an article about Julius Braun that she sent me, or part of the article. And she also sent me this picture of him, I believe her grandfather or great-grandfather. And I put it up here for people to see. In fact, here's his house. You can see the house here with some old cars sitting out in front. And this is exactly the location where the bank building is today. And 4th Street would be just beyond the house, and then on the corner is the commercial building that's still there on the northwest corner of Main and 4th Street. But here's the bank building, and I showed you that earlier, the southwest corner of 4th and Main. That's where the Braun house was located. I believe it was Bill Sullivan who sent me this photograph of what appears to be a jail. It's kind of put together with wrought iron and probably rivets or bolts, just put together like a large cage. Whether it was inside a building or not, we don't know, but it's in somebody's backyard in Royal Oak presently. A mystery surrounds this structure, whether it really was used for a jail at one time. Somebody needs to research it. Well, thank you very much for spending some time with me in this 4th class on Royal Oak History 101.